I salute you guys. You had the best seats, and you probably had like 5 drinks already, so you're gonna have a great time. Can I get a sense, how many of you guys were either born outside of the States or you have ancestry from elsewhere? A bunch. Have you been back to visit those places? You know, ever since my family immigrated, I've wanted to go back to Russia. But I was scared because my parents basically raised me to believe that Russia was the worst place in the world. That it was this lawless, corrupt hellhole full of skinheads and homeless alcoholics and degenerate former KGB agents and mean old women who would stand by the side of the road and spit at you and just hurt your feelings for no good reason. There's total decay and sadness everywhere. And I came to believe that if I ever dared to go to Russia, several things would definitely happen. First, my money and my passport would get stolen immediately by radioactive Chernobyl street urchins. Then suddenly hordes of rabid anti-Semites would descend from the bushes and just start beating me and stabbing me and calling me mean names. And then for the finale, like a homeless alcoholic drug addict would somersault from out of nowhere and chew my face off and I would get AIDS and die. And as I listened to my parents, I thought, you know, I wasn't that little when we moved away. I was 8 years old. Like, I do have some happy memories that challenge the notion of Russia as this total den of despair, you know? I remember when I was 6 years old, for New Year's, my dad dressed up as Grandfather Frost, who's like the Russian Santa Claus, but better, because he's always accompanied by a sexy young snow maiden. And my dad had the velvet robe and the beard and everything, and he came to my first grade classroom, and he gave every child a hand-painted wooden horse, which was kind of an odd gift for a 6-year-old. You couldn't really play with it. All you could do was put it up on a shelf next to a bunch of hand-painted wooden spoons. Just admire the handiwork and think about all the serfs we died developing this proud national art form. I remember one day our apartment was broken into, and I was too small to understand what was going on, but I got so excited that I got on the phone immediately to call a friend who lived across the courtyard to brag, you know, because I knew that he'd be jealous that my apartment was broken into and not his. And my dad takes the phone away from me. He's like, what are you doing? You can't be telling people about this. And I'm like, are you kidding? I have to tell everyone. Even now, sometimes I have trouble being discreet and keeping things to myself, which is what this is all about. But I think my most vivid childhood memory is this video I have. It's a home video that was taken just a couple of days before we boarded the plane to immigrate to the States. And we're having a goodbye party in my grandparents' apartment, which is this beautiful apartment in the middle of Moscow that's full of books and antiques. And at this party, there's an uncle of mine who, in a couple of years after the Soviet Union dissolved, made a little bit of money. And he had a lot of really cool possessions. Like, he had a Sega Genesis, which was great. And my favorite thing that he had was this book by an artist whose whole thing was making like really primitive pencil sketches of things super quickly. And next to every sketch, there was the amount of time that it took him to draw it. So you would see this like indecipherable scribble that's titled a bird, and you'd be like, the hell, this doesn't look anything like a bird. And then you saw that it took him 0.7 seconds, and you'd be like, holy shit, that's incredible. And so this uncle also had a video camera, which he brought to this party. And in the video that resulted, you know, there's my mom looking young and very charming, and there's my older sister looking sort of annoyed, wearing some kind of denim vest. And there's me, you know, this gleeful, exuberant kid who's running around and singing and laughing and getting in everyone's way. And I remember at some point, somebody gets the idea to sit me down and conduct an interview with me. And I do amazing on this interview. I'm very media savvy at that age. I remember the two most hard-hitting kind of gotcha questions that I get are, one, what do I want to be when I grow up? I say rabbi, great answer. And two, whether I think in America I'm going to be friends with any black children. And I just thank God I said yes. Because if I happen to be a racist 8-year-old, that really would have put a blemish on this pristine childhood memory that got preserved on video. It would have been quite a gaffe. I know many of us idealize our childhoods because of all the difficult things that our parents don't tell us when we're little. You know, but when my family and I moved to Brooklyn, I changed. You know, I wasn't that happy kid any longer. I became sort of sullen and withdrawn. I would write these angry things in my diary about how America was stupid. I would have made a great blogger for the Huffington Post or something. It was a very confusing time because I didn't speak any English and I didn't understand anything that was going on at school. Just to give you an example, at one point my mom bought me this green jacket with the logo of the Jets, you know, the football team on it. And every morning, I would walk into my 3rd grade classroom, and my homeroom teacher, who was also the gym teacher, like every morning he would grin at me and say, I like your jacket, guy. And It took me literally years to realize that he was probably just a Jets fan and not a pedophile like I originally assumed. And there was this other Russian kid in my class. I thought he was going to be my friend, but he turned out to be a bully. Like, I asked to borrow a pencil, and he gave me one, but it was covered with his saliva. I was like, there's no one I can trust! Saboteurs everywhere! Elementary school was very Soviet in that regard. And so I think it was during those early years that I developed this complex, like a fear, call it paranoid, but this suspicion that there were things that I just didn't know, things I didn't understand about myself, about the world, and other people knew. Like, other people understood, but they just refused to tell me. And this continued even through college. Like, I remember I was on a date with a girl who asked me what my greatest fear was. And I told her what I told you. And then I asked her what her greatest fear was, and she said dying alone. And for some reason I got competitive. I was like, well, I'm afraid of that too. And then she told me her favorite movie was Apollo 13, and I was like, damn, I should have said my greatest fear is my oxygen tank exploding en route to the moon. Later, when she told me she wasn't interested, my gut reaction was like, okay, what don't you like about me? Neither of us is leaving this room until you tell me what's wrong with me and how I can fix it. Like, I thought that she'd be able to tell me something about myself that I didn't know, And I think ultimately that was like the underlying reason why I wanted to go to Russia to begin with. I thought that if I didn't go, I wouldn't get closure on something. Some part of me would stay repressed. Like, I would never get this secret, hidden information about myself that I needed. I would never be able to untie this knot inside of myself. And the first time I tried to go was in college. They study abroad where essentially your school saves a ton of money by getting rid of you for a year. And so you can go someplace where you can drink cheap beer outdoors and take one semester of a foreign language that you'll never use or remember. And I thought this was an awesome idea, but when I broached the subject with my parents about potentially going to Russia, my mom was like, are you trying to give me a heart attack? And I was like, Mom, no, I'm not. And she was like, I'll have one. I was like, Mom, stop, you're going to give me a heart attack. That's like the leverage we have on each other. And I remember back in school, I went to this guidance counselor to tell him about the conversation that I had with my parents. And this very earnest, well-intentioned guidance counselor said to me, look, it's easy. All you have to do is sit your parents down and say, look, Mom and Dad, you raised me to take an interest in my family heritage. You made me this way, so take some responsibility for how you brought me up. And I was like, wow, this is going to be an awesome speech, because clearly there's no better way to get your parents to approve of your life choices than to just blame them for the person you became. Like, I even came up with a great finish. I was going to be like, I didn't ask to be born, So I gave my parents this speech, but they still didn't budge. When my parents grab hold of an irrational viewpoint, it's very difficult to change their minds. For example, I know that every couple of months, my mom calls my sister and asks her if I'm gay. And I keep telling my mom, like, if I were gay, I would have no reason to hide it. I mean, first of all, I go to drama school where that's a professional advantage. And second of all, like, trying to date women in their 20s is the worst, because if you think about it, they're at their most attractive, and I'm at my least accomplished. They have the most dating power they'll ever have, and I have the least. So why would I participate in that unless I had no choice, Mom? Every once in a while, she'll test me, she'll buy me a V-neck. And if I permit her to return into Century 21 immediately, that would mean that her suspicions were correct. My mom's main objection to me going to Russia, by the way, at all, was that she was convinced that I would get conscripted into the Russian army. Which seemed preposterous to me, but I think she really believed it. And she cultivated this new hobby where she would forward me articles about this one incident in which a young Russian army conscript was hazed so viciously by his fellow soldiers that he had to have both his legs and his genitals amputated. And this is what I think my mom thought would happen to me, that I would land in Moscow, get whisked away into a tank, en route to Chechnya, and before I could get blown up by extremists, my own fellow Russian soldiers would take a lead pipe or something and just bash my genitals right in. After a while, I sort of had to drop the issue. I went to study abroad in Prague instead. Maybe you've been to Prague, you guys been? Yeah, it was good, but I mean, I wanted to go because I read all those novels about the American expats in Prague, and all the writers and artists and interesting people and dissidents. What I failed to take into account was that if you go someplace because you read a lot of novels about that place, like, you're at least 15 years too late to the party. By the time I was in Prague, it was no longer the Paris of the 90s. It was more like the place where if you ask for something vegetarian, they bring you a stew made of fermented pig intestine. But the desire to go to Russia never left. And in my early 20s, I wanted to go more than ever because I felt a little lost and ill-equipped for what happens next, And I thought, when a big milestone happens, like a college graduation, you're supposed to celebrate your life. But I didn't feel like I had that much to celebrate, so instead I mourned. I mourned the person I never became. I mourned that really happy kid from the video. And I started thinking, who knows, what if? Maybe if I had grown up in Russia, maybe I would have learned to play the guitar or done things like mountain climbing. Maybe I would have become an architect or an oligarch or some other alpha male profession. Who knows, and I felt like I needed to know, what had I lost? What part of myself had I left there? I remember at one point I was in a library in Brooklyn. I was having a book sale. And I bought this book for $1. It's called A Moscow Traveler's Companion, published in 1984. And I thought it would just be full of like pleasant walking tours and descriptions of imperial architecture and gardens and things like that. But it's actually more like a list of fires, famines, murders, plagues, rapes, genocides, just all sorts of atrocities that were committed on Russian soil. There's also some poetry, which is nice. And one of my favorite poems was written by a 17th century Austrian nobleman who was on a diplomatic mission to Moscow. And I just want to quickly read you this poem. I think it really captures the essence of the spirit of the Russian people. All right, dramatic reading, here we go. Churches, icons, crosses, bells, painted whores and garlic smells. Vice and vodka everywhere, this is Moscow's daily face. To loiter in the market air, to bathe and calm on bodies bare, to sleep by day and gorge by night, to belch and fart is their delight. Thieving, murdering, fornication are so common in this nation. No one thinks a brow to raise, such are Moscow's sordid days. Yeah, so I think that Austrian nobleman nailed it. And then one fateful day, out of nowhere, the generous Tribeca organization, in its infinite wisdom, decides to give me a little bit of money. And I decide to use that money towards the trip to finally go to Russia. I make the mistake of telling my dad about it. And he goes into my bedroom. He never goes in there unless it's to change the halogen light bulb in the torch here. That's the only reason. And he said something that I've never heard anybody in my family ever say before. And I haven't heard anyone in my family say it since. Words that completely astonish me. He sits on my bed, looks me in the eyes, and says, "Give the money back." I'm rendered completely speechless. And I realized that if I follow through with this trip, I'm just going to have to keep it a secret from my parents for a while, I mean, worst comes to worst, I show up on my mom's Google awards for gruesome army amputations. And once I make that decision, I realized that getting a travel visa to go to Russia for me is actually going to be a little bit difficult. To make a very boring story as short as possible, Russia recognizes dual citizenship. I don't know, maybe some of you guys have come across this, but according to them, I'm still a Russian citizen, but I can't go over there as a Russian citizen, because if I get into any kind of trouble, like if I commit treason by accident, if I see a bear on the street and fail to salute him properly, then I won't be able to go to the American embassy for help. And the only way that I could get a Russian visa in my American passport is if I get involved with some kind of petty criminal element that knows the right person to bribe. And I get really excited about this. It's actually a special treat for me. It's very disappointing for me not to know anyone in the Russian mafia. It's not fair. It's very frustrating to be part of a culture with a healthy mafia presence, but you don't actually know anyone personally. It's like, if you're Cuban, but you don't know any drug lords, like, what's the point? So I called my friend Rika, and she gives me the number of this guy, Sasha. I call him up. He's this 60-year-old, raspy-voiced Russian man who I imagine is eating a large sandwich, smoking a cigarette, watching figure skating on TV in his underwear. And he tells me to come into his office on 34th Street. And after he gives me the address, I asked to clarify like, what building exactly. And he says it's next door to Victoria's Secret, his favorite store. I wonder, like, is he dropping a hint? Like, is his birthday coming out? Should I get a gift certificate? So I go to his office. It's all, tall filing cabinets and carpeting that's probably full of asbestos. And immediately, Sasha gets very paternal with me. He starts giving me life advice. Apropos of nothing, he says, the most important thing in life is love. Some say health, but I say it's love. Then he looks at me for confirmation to see what I think about that. And I'm thinking, like, is this some kind of test? I mean, typically, if someone were to ask me to choose between love and health, I would be like, what STD do you have that you're not telling me about? So I explained my situation to Sasha, and he says, you can't have two citizenships. Actually, he doesn't quite say it like that. What he says is, no matter how big your ass is, you can only sit in one chair at a time. I grasped the metaphor. English major. So then, I show him my mother's old Soviet passport, and he's flipping through it, and he's pointing out to me all the various parts of it. And then he reaches into his desk drawer, and he takes out a stack of like 30 Soviet passports. I'm like, Sasha, where did you get these? Where is this truck full of random Soviets whose identities you've stolen? So in the end, he quotes me, a really exorbitant rate that I imagine he will split with a consulate official, and then I tell him I'll think it over, we shake hands, and he wishes me the fulfillment of my every desire. And as I leave, I'm a little discouraged that this is going to be more expensive than I thought. But also, I'm a little peeved that Sasha hadn't revealed to me all the machinations of this criminal passport empire, that I imagine to be replete with bribes and forgeries and 6-year-old Russian man eating sausages and developing ulcers and committing paid fraud against various governments, possibly wearing Victoria's Secret underpants. And I started thinking, if I only had access to that world, then maybe I could be like one of those cool Russian guys, like the wear a leather jacket, an enormous chain with a huge Star of David on it, who party in these acting lounges in Queens and work at a cell phone emporium or UPS, but could somehow afford $80 Armani t-shirts and accommodate the expensive tastes of a blonde girlfriend named Anna. When I was about 10, I had an arch nemesis in school. It was this Russian kid named Julian. And at one point, I signed up to take ballroom dance lessons at the Jewish Community Center on Ocean Parkway. And when I showed up for the first day, I found out that apparently Julian had taken the class the year before, and he was some kind of legend there, Like, all the 10-year-old girls wanted to dance with Julian, and when everybody paired up for the final recital, Julian's partner was like the prettiest, most coordinated Jewish girl in the group. It was by all accounts like a real heartbreaker. And I was thinking, like, I'm just getting it from all sides. Like, my whole objective for the year is to learn to hold a girl by the waist without passing out from all the blood rushing out of my head. Like, that's the goal that I set for myself. Like, I don't need to be compared unfavorably to Julian in what is already an extremely high-pressure environment. And then what happens is, my mom meets his mom at a parent-teacher conference, and they became friends, and suddenly I'm getting to save at home. Like, my mom is asking me how Julian is doing, and what summer camp he's going to, and how, he did on some math quiz. And I was just thinking, like, Mom, you've made it abundantly clear that you wish you had given birth to Julian. I get it, maybe you can adopt Julian, and I could be shipped off to an orphanage for children who can't dance salsa as well as Julian can. I bring all this up because at the time I thought that he would turn out to be like one of those Russian guys, who go to those nightclubs and eventually would get alcohol poisoning, that would lead to brain damage, and then the only job he could get is as a janitor at our own junior high school. I thought that would be like the ultimate Robbins, But then I Facebook stalked him 15 years later, and it turns out that he went to business school and is now an associate at an investment bank. But his Facebook profile photo is him wearing like a neon lime green shirt, playing golf, looking like a real douche. And his favorite quotation is, don't sweat the petty things and don't pet the sweaty things. So I still think like I came out on top there. Anyhow, after my encounter with Sasha, I start getting cold feet a little bit, second thoughts. I start thinking like, do I even like travel? Basics. Like, I know it's this thing that everyone is supposed to like, but what is really that good about it? I mean, you spend a ton of money, you check things off from some lame travel guide checklist. And here's the thing that most people forget. Just because you're traveling, that doesn't automatically make you more interesting. Like, you're still the same asshole in Europe that you were in America. Not fooling anybody. And then of course I thought, why would I want to be in a place that's full of Russians? I mean, not like this place is great. But, I've always felt uncomfortable going to Russian doctors because I felt like they were in cahoots with my mother, like she would know before I did whether my moles were cancerous, or whether a tear in my cornea was slowly making me blind. I've always hated going to Russian delis because of the, dour and impatient look that the clerks give you if you take a little too long figuring out the pickles you want. At one point, when I was 12, I was in a Russian video store, and the woman behind the counter asked me if I were a boy or a girl. It was like the ultimate humiliation. Though to be fair, I was wearing a lot of gender-ambiguous Panama hats at the time. And underneath it all, of course, I think, what if I go over there and nothing happens? Like, what if I don't get this secret hidden information about myself that I'm looking for? What if I don't get this blazing epiphany? But of course, eventually, I sort of have to stop rationalizing and do something, so I call up Sasha and I negotiate him way down, and 2 weeks later I have my visa. At first, I don't tell my parents about it, but eventually I have to, First, my mom doesn't talk to me about it for a couple of days, but then I have to buy a plane ticket, and she swoops right in. You know, she gets involved. There are 2 airports in Moscow, and you may know that at one of them there was a terrorist attack last year. And that's the one that has affordable flights going to it. But my mother tells me that if I fly to that airport, I'm just asking to get suicide bombed. I'm begging for it. And I have to tell her, you know, Mom, like, they already bombed that one. You have to think like a terrorist. You probably want to diversify a little bit. Next time go up the other airport. You know, but she says, well, that's what they want you to think. And I'm like, well, this is a game that never ends. You know, this is like, if you're given a cup of poison and you're thinking like, well, they wouldn't expect me to take the poison that's in front of me, the cup that's in front of me, so the poison must be in the other cup, you know, and on forever. So eventually I buy a ticket, and I get on a plane, and I fly to Moscow. And when I'm there, I'm standing at customs. There's a very dour woman, you know, who's blonde and very angular, and looks like a supermodel. If only somebody would discover her. And when I show her my American passport, she refuses to speak Russian with me. And I'm like, real mature customs lady. And I expect something to go wrong. Like either my visa is fake, or you know, or there's a drug-addicted, radioactive, former KGB agent crouching behind a currency exchange ready to tackle me. But then I get my passport handed back to me, and I've been granted access. And I walk the length of the airport, and when I get to the exit, where there's a bunch of, like a cluster of cab drivers looking for people who need a fare, looking for people who need a ride to the city, I imagine I'm going to get, you know, bullied and hassled and quoted outrageous fares. But then this middle-aged man comes up to me with like a haggard face and gray hair, and in the most defeatist tone imaginable says, let's go. And underneath that let's go, I hear so much sad subtext. Like some of the subtext I hear is, let's go, get into my car or don't. I don't really care. I have one final shred of pride left, and I'm not going to waste it by begging you to get into my car. My car's a piece of shit. My apartment's a joke. I'm systematically dehumanized by my government. My wife thinks I'm a weak man. My country's turning into a plutocracy that I don't recognize or understand. You know, I have no competitive advantage in any area of life at all, and each day is a barrage of humiliations and disappointments that are feeding the depression that's killing me from within. That said, let's go for an awesome ride! But I say no thank you, and I get a ride into the city on a charter bus, sitting next to a man that smells like some combination of cigarettes, gasoline, urine, and rotting fish. And when I get to the center of Moscow, I go to Red Square, a place, surprisingly, with no Russians whatsoever. It's all just Korean and German tourist groups there. And I see St. Basil's Cathedral, which looks, you know, probably colorful. I just want to unwrap the foil and eat the chocolate inside. And I set down my roller bag, which has been annoyingly knocking against every cobblestone, and I'm so happy I finally made it. I make sure that my passport is secure, like that no one has penetrated the fortress that is my passport pouch. And I've got the red bricks of the Crown Palaces to my right, and beyond that is the beautiful embankment of the Moscow River. And to the left of me is a luxury shopping mall where I could buy a MacBook with a Cyrillic keyboard if I wanted to. I should mention that the first thing that happens to me in Moscow is I get a bad cold almost immediately because I'm not used to Russian viruses, so they just attack me. And I spent my first few days there in this haze of congestion and sinus pressure, my nose is running, my throat is ragged, I'm tearing my nostrils on Russian Kleenex, which for some reason is much coarser than American Kleenex and always smells like synthetic berries. And on my first day there, I go to Lenin's mausoleum. You know, this is where you can see Lenin's embalmed body in the temperature-controlled sarcophagus. It's like a huge tourist attraction. It's like Madame Tussauds, if Madame Tussauds were actual corpses. Although, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's this conspiracy theory that it's not actually Lenin in there, that every few years he's like switched out with a look-alike. I don't know where they find them. I guess the more called auditions. So I spend like 45 minutes and I go in there. And you know, you can't really linger. You're rushed along by these uniformed guards. And suddenly I feel this like heavy hand on my shoulder pressing down. And I turn around and I see this enormous guard behind me. And I'm thinking like, well, now it begins. You know, everything my parents warned me about. Like, I'm being profiled because I don't look like an ethnic Slav. And I just got there, so I haven't gotten my traveler's registration process yet. I'm gonna get detained, I'm gonna get fined. And then all the guard tells me is to get my hands out of my pockets. Like, it's just the etiquette police in there. You know, I feel like there should be like a list of 10 don'ts, like at the swimming pool, you know, like don't keep your hands in your pockets, don't roll your eyes in disdain, don't touch Lenin inappropriately. That's all the top of my head. By the way, the whole time I was in Russia, I kept my eyes peeled for anti-Semites. I was really hoping to see one. I know I'm not supposed to get myself into these situations, but I felt like, I was on a safari and there were exotic birds or something, I wanted to attract them so badly, I even stopped shaving. I looked like a Jewish hobbit. And I saw a couple of incidents. So one day, I'm walking along Tribeca, which is one of the central Moscow streets, and I see this woman hobbling in like really tall heels, hopping down the sidewalk, screaming into her cell phone, "This Jewish bitch stole my man!" And I'm filled with pride. And I think, way to go, Jewish bitch. Good for you. I'm on your team, you get that, man. And the other incident, I was in the metro and I found myself sitting across from this couple in their mid-50s who were drunk off their asses. And they're making out, and I'm not against people of all ages showing affection in public, but this is really too much. I mean, the man is like groping the woman, and he's pushing his tongue into her mouth. Like, it's one of the grossest things I've ever seen on public transportation, which is saying a lot because I'm from New York. And so it turns out that we all get out in the same stop. And, and I'm heading towards the escalator, but I hold back a little bit to let them get on first, because I want to keep watching this unfold. And they do get on first, but then the woman turns around and yells at me, "Why'd you get behind us, you with the Jew face?" I'm taken aback a little bit, like that's not really insulting, just accurate, I guess. But on the other hand, I was the only one there, so she could have just said "you with the face." I realize much worse things happen every day, but I was happy that I got to check that off my travel guide checklist. Ring the bell, ding ding, I won the anti-Semite scavenger hunt. What was I going to tell you guys after? I bet there was something really super coming after this. I'm just going to have to look it up, you guys. Sorry about this. Yeah, okay, cool. Hey, I should have remembered this segue. Speaking of people yelling at me, I guess a lot of stories begin that way. I went to a house where Chekhov lived for a few years. And, where you could see a lot of really neat Chekhov paraphernalia. You could see his inkwell and his walking stick, his briefcase, his writing desk. There's a very sad, kind of wilted-looking houseplant in the corner, playing the role of a lifetime as Chekhov's houseplant. And it's a pretty small house, so I go around it pretty quickly, and I want to go back in, to examine some things a little more closely. But then this woman starts chasing after me, yelling, "You can't go back in there, you've seen enough." I just want to, pretend like that's my inkwell and that's my briefcase. But she's like, "No, you can't go back in there, you have to pay again." And I got very huffy and defensive. I was like, Chekhov would be appalled if he knew how you were treating a guest in his house. And the ghost of Chekhov came up and was like, "Don't be a dick. You have to pay again." So I did. Just kidding about the last part. I was having dinner with a friend of mine, Tom, who's a journalist in Moscow. And after we eat, he says to me, "Do you want to go to this bar called Hot Dog?" And I say, "Why would we want to go to a bar called Hot Dog? That sounds like a terrible place." And he says, "Because it's full of prostitutes." And I'm like, "Well, Tom, I feel like as a journalist you buried the lead. Now that I have this really crucial bit of information, Hot Dog sounds like an incredibly appropriate name for that establishment." So we go over there, and the cover charge is 800 rubles, which is about $40. And Tom was like, "Yeah, it's a little steep unless we want an actual prostitute." And I'm like, "Okay, well, so let's get out of here." But then he goes up to the bouncer, and he's like, "Is it okay if we just go in there to see if there's anything we like?" And the bouncer, to my surprise, is like, "Yeah, sure, come right in." Like, they're way friendlier at Hot Dog than in the Chekhov house. So we go in, and it's true, there are about a dozen very, very, very boring-looking women in miniskirts. And I have this little, indulge in this little Dostoevskian fantasy where I befriend a prostitute with a heart of gold and she reveals the secret of life to me, and she, cracks through my shell of cynicism and sarcasm to teach me all about compassion and humility. But then Tom is like, "Well, they know we're not here to buy, we don't look rich enough." And I was like, "Well, I didn't realize there was a dress code, I wouldn't have worn shorts." No, there's no, what's the 10 don'ts for Hot Dog? So then the bouncer comes back and he's like, so did you see anything you like? And we're like, no, thank you, and we leave. Speaking of the secret of life, at one point I went to a public bathhouse. By the way, if you guys have ever wanted to be in a room full of like 100 middle-aged Russian men totally naked, you're in luck, because such a place exists. And it's not one of those like wussy Western-style saunas where you sweat a little bit and then you dip in the pool. This is like a scorching, scalding, just inferno where you feel like your organs are swelling and your veins are about to burst. And most of the men there are wearing these little like terry cloth Peter Pan-looking hats to keep their heads from overheating. And I didn't know that that's what they were for, so I didn't get one. And I'm like shielding my head with my hands to keep my brain from exploding. And of course, when you can't take it anymore, that's when you go into this like ice-cold pool where you basically go numb all over and you just never want to have any emotions ever again. And I started talking to this group of dudes who turned out to be from Southern California and Texas, who were in Moscow for the express purpose of recruiting an all-star basketball team. And I'm like, did you come to the bathhouse to recruit? Like, is that how that works? They're like, no, we just came here to relax. And I see that they're having like far more fun than I'm having. You know, they're like whooping each other with towels and splashing each other, drinking beer, like having a good old time. And I'm standing there like really awkward and uncomfortable. You know, I remember when I was 11, I went to a sauna with my dad, and it was wintertime, and all of a sudden he like goes out of the sauna and like runs outdoors and rubs fresh snow all over himself. And I followed him, I did it too, like I wasn't not gonna do it, but you know, I wanted to be a man, but even at that age, I was like, there must be another way. So I started, in the bathhouse, I started chatting with this kind of sprightly, very affable Russian guy who tells me that he goes to the bathhouse every week. And he asked me where I'm from, we chat a little bit. And I'm very, impressed to find out that this is such a prominent part of his lifestyle. You know, there's probably like a spiritual philosophy behind this. Maybe he has the secret. And I asked him, what is the protocol? How am I supposed to optimize this experience? And he said something that I really didn't expect, like something that really took me by surprise and made me think. Something very thought-provoking. He put his hand on my shoulder, and this totally naked Russian man wearing nothing but a little terry cloth hat. And he says, well, it's like you Americans say, Hakuna Matata. Thank you for that ancient wisdom. Like, why does he think that that is what Americans say? Like, how is that like a morsel of pop culture that made its way over there? Oh yeah, I was going to tell you how Russia is a really sad place. There are a ton of alcoholics. So when I was there, I really got into kvass. You guys like kvass? Any kvass fans? Yeah, so did you hear any booze for kvass? No, that was all booze. So it's a very delicious and refreshing non-alcoholic beverage made of fermented rye. And I was constantly in corner grocery stores buying kvass, and more often than not, there would be this man with a dirty jacket and a face like raw meat asking for the cheapest brand of vodka, which is usually about the price of bottled water. And one time I was in one of those stores, and a man like that came in, and they tell him how much the cheapest brand of vodka costs, and then he's like, your competitors across the street have it for less. I'm taking my business there. And I was impressed. I was like, he's done his research. Even the alcoholics are educated consumers. Something that really struck me about Russia is that there's like a whole class of people whose job it is to just sit there and be bored all day. Like in public places and museums, there's like 100 old Russian women just sitting there all day. In grocery stores, there's like a guy in every aisle looking around for shoplifters. I would often see like 2 portable toilets, and in the middle is a booth with a woman collecting 20 rubles. In public buses, there's always a conductor collecting the fare. It's like, it's really depressing. Like, it's not as though Russia doesn't have metro card technology, but presumably they have to give all these people jobs, like either old people whose skills were made obsolete by the Public Soviet Union, or young people with no education. And one night, I take an overnight train to St. Petersburg. I'm in steerage, and the train leaves at 1 in the morning, so it's full of migrant workers, gypsy women with small children. And I try to make conversation with the guy in the cop crossing line, but he just takes a swig from his glass, turns to the wall, and falls asleep. And when I get to St. Petersburg, it's pouring rain. It actually rains the whole time that I'm there. And I'm staying with this guy named Vasya. We used to go to school with my mother. He was about like 40 minutes, like a 40-minute bus ride from the center of the city. And she said, what are like the sentient characteristics about him? His whole apartment is covered in cat hair. There's stuffed animals everywhere, and they all reek of cigarettes. Everything he eats is submerged in mayonnaise. He has the television on every waking hour because he doesn't like the quiet. And when he goes to the kitchen to get us some tea, he comes back with 2 like dried up used tea bags. And at first I find all of this like really endearing and interesting, and I think we're going to be great friends. But the more time we spend together, the more sort of difficult and depressing that he becomes to be together. I mean, he's pretty judgmental and stubborn and sort of condescending. Even though most of his friends have immigrated, he thinks that anybody who leaves St. Petersburg for any reason is like a total idiot. He has a son who comes in for 20 minutes to eat with us and doesn't really talk to anyone and then disappears. I find all this extremely demoralizing. And then the next morning, I go to this museum that Peter the Great established in the 18th century to house what he called his collection of ethnological curiosities, which are really just jars upon jars of deformed fetuses. Like fetuses with 3 arms, with 2 heads, with no head. Really like freaky stuff. I mean, like, to be a fly on the wall when Peter the Great got that idea. Like lounging around the palace thinking, like scratching his head thinking like, what don't I have yet? I've got it, bring me fetuses. They bring him fetuses and he's like, 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, boring. 3 arms, no head, perfect. So, you know, it's kind of a place that sort of like saps your life force out of you. And as I stumble out of this museum onto the torrential downpour taking place outside, I feel like I've hit some kind of emotional rock bottom. You know, I started thinking like, oh, and I forgot to mention it was also my birthday that day. And I started thinking like, why did I come to this depressing place, you know, halfway across the world from everyone I know and like? And I started like missing my parents. I mean, they gave me 2 arms and 1 head, among other advantages in life, and thank God they left when they did because they could have become my quasi, I could have become like that kid who comes home for 20 minutes, doesn't talk to anybody, disappears. And I get this feeling like I got an organ transplant that my body was rejecting. You know, I started thinking, like, was come to Russia, you know, fool's errand? I mean, maybe I'll never get that secret hidden information that I came there to get. I mean, what if I don't find it there? What if I never find it? And my stomach clenches, and I get this jolt, like I just have to get out of there. So I go to the train station with the intention of buying a ticket for back to Moscow for the following evening, but all they have is first class, which I can't afford. And just impulsively, without thinking, I buy a ticket for a train that leaves in an hour and a half. And I sprint to the bus back to Moscow's place, and you know, I grab my bag and I tell him, I'm so sorry I have to leave so abruptly, and thank you so much. And he insists on getting in the taxi with me back to the train station. And in the taxi, he turns to me and he's like, you know what? And I say, what? And he's like, you're an idiot. And I'm like, why is it just because I want to get out of St. Petersburg that doesn't automatically make me an idiot? Like, there are other qualifications. But then, when we get to this train station, he gives me a little like souvenir decorative spoon that says St. Petersburg on it, and he says, happy birthday. I guess my mother told him. And I'm really moved. I'm like, you know, even idiots can use a decorative spoon. Those things are great. And of course, when I'm back on the train, I feel just like an absolute jerk, you know? I mean, I thought he was judgmental, but obviously, like, I was the judgmental one. I mean, I had him pegged as this Soviet mutant, and of course, like, how did I say that about anybody? I mean, he was thoughtful and a nice guy, and certainly the most interesting person I've met in Russia. Spent a ton of time with me, but it's too late. Like, I'm already on the overnight train back to Moscow, and I'm exhausted. And night is falling, and for what seems like the millionth time in the past couple of weeks, I check to make sure that my passport is secure in this little pouch, and I fall dead asleep. And the next morning, when I'm back in Moscow, I'm all over again. I'm stunned by how beautiful everything is. You know, the squares, the arches, the pavilions, all the stone and marble everywhere, the sense of grandeur and open space. There's just no urban area in New York where you see so much ground ahead of you and so much sky above you. You know, the alleys, the bridges, the courtyards, the cobblestones, the underground passageways, the churches, cathedrals, the monuments, just breathtaking things everywhere you look. And on one of my last days in Moscow, I do something that I've been meaning to do. I take the metro and the bus to the Northeastern Administrative District on the outskirts of the city to visit the neighborhood where I grew up. And as I'm trying to find the building where my family and I lived when I was a child, it's very difficult to find because all the buildings are numbered in sort of confusing ways and there are no street signs exactly. But finally I find it, this enormous gray Soviet-era monstrosity, you know, like a huge courtyard and 5 different entrances. And as I'm walking around the neighborhood, all these memories come pouring in, and just my heart is overflowing. And in my mind's eye, I see myself so vividly as this 8-year-old kid who's running around and singing and laughing and getting in everyone's way, who's going to be a rabbi and have so many black friends in America, who's going to embrace the possibilities and the challenges of this new life with hope, with love, with courage, with an open heart. And as I'm walking around the building, I see at one of the entrances, this girl is sitting on a stoop, about my age, and smoking a cigarette. And I want to come up to her because I start thinking like, well, if she's lived in this building for years, she's had a life I didn't have. She knows things I don't know. But before I could come up to her, she gets a call on her cell phone. And she starts talking on the phone so loudly that I really can't help but stop and eavesdrop. And I hear her say the following: Ilya, I'm so happy for you and that slut. But I've got better things to do than to worry about you two assholes. You're not my friend. Everything you do is to make me suffer. We're not friends and we never were. I never want to talk to you again. And if you've got something you want to discuss with me, you better wait to bring it up with my cold, dead fucking corpse. And I'm like, oh my god. And I'm immediately knocked out of this reverie of nostalgia that I was in. And then I see her pause for a moment to hear what Yosha has to say about that. And then I hear her say, look, what didn't you like about me? You're not getting off this phone until you tell me what's wrong with me and how I can fix it. And I smile, and I hope that she finds that secret hidden thing about herself that everyone else seems to know, but for some reason just refuses to tell her. Then I turn around and walk back to the bus. Thank you.